So if you look at any introduction to sociology textbook, you tend to find that the thing that I'm getting ready to talk about tends to happen or tends to find itself at the end of the chapter. In the textbook that we're currently using when I'm recording this video, it's chapter number 21, usually way at the end. And the reason why is because it's the chapter that sort of sets you up for like going forward, here's what you should do. Essentially, once I've told you everything that there is to know about societies and how they operate, and what the problems or debates or complications are with the society, then sort of the task is on you, new sociologists, to figure out how to change the world. So social movements and social change tends to become part of that conversation at the end of the chapter or the end of the semester. Um, I want to talk about it at this part because we've just finished talking about what we understand about groups and behavior, groups and organizations, and then the idea that, once we set up this whole structure and understand how it works, that the truth is that it never happens in that ideal way, that we're deviant. People don't do what they're supposed to do all the time, and that deviance can actually be a good thing because it might be, and it usually is, the way that generates social change. We're not the same society that we were generations and generations and generations ago. And so the question is, how are we making that change? We've talked before about how society changes or the ways that we think about society changes, either through the formulation of ideas and trying to be better, or because we consider ourselves to be members of society and we work together in interdependent or organic solidarity, or we've talked about it sort of in questions of conflict. We solve our problems, or we participate in revolutions and really just overturn something and start over. And then we really talked a lot about sort of the role of technology. And in the beginning of the development of sociology, we were talking about the Industrial Revolution in particular. So we talked about the role that ideas or technology or revolution has in the impetus of social change. The question is always, how did we get to where we are? And then where is it that we're going? When we find that things are changing and we are confused or struggling with the ideas of culture lag, some things are changing way too fast and we're ready to keep up with it. We always ask this question, are we growing? Is this a good idea? How do we keep stable versus how do we keep from destabilizing? Is this a growth problem, or is this a we're changing too fast and we have to stop it problem? So what change looks like when it's happening is always a question. And again, that's why it tends to happen at the end of the chapter or the end of the semester, because it's kind of like your marching orders, right? It comes later. But we just finished talking about deviance and how deviance sometimes is the way that things are changing because we're not doing what's generally expected. We're making changes. I thought it was a good time to talk about it here. So, social change, by definition, is the transformation of societies and social institutions over time. Social change. Your book says it's the change in a society created through social movements as well as through external factors like environmental shifts or technological innovations. We've talked about technological innovations. With the changes that we had in the industrial revolution, we saw a lot of changes in society. With environmental shifts, when we talk about what happens when a community is affected by a superstorm or a hurricane, or on the West Coast, what happens when a community is affected by large wildfires, what happens when a community is affected by any kind of environmental shift, a drought, or something that changes the way that we settle, or changes the rules of how we use our resources or have any expectation of our resources. It can be environmental shifts, it can be technological shifts, but it can be because the people made that change through their behavior or social movement. What's important to know about social change is that it's happening all the time. A material culture is going to change faster than non-material culture, but the change is happening all the time. We're always in the middle of the change. We can always look back and say, how do we get here? Well, there's people who are living in the middle of it. There's always changing. Sometimes that change is intentional and sometimes it's unplanned. Again, we don't intend environmental shifts, for instance, that might change our migration patterns or where we settle or some super tragedy that has happened in natural disasters, right? Sometimes it's not intentional. But sometimes those social changes are very intentional. We're debating things about what our new laws should be or how we should interact. We participate in social movements and protests. We develop the technology that might change the way that we do things. Sometimes we're responding to what has happened. We went through the COVID pandemic, and it changes even the ways that we understand education and education technology. So sometimes very much intended, sometimes not so much. The change, though, is almost always controversial. Even when we all have to deal with a particular tragedy and it affected everybody, we don't agree on what the next steps are. Again, not only are we fighting with how non-material change is happening slower than material change, but we've got values that we're not necessarily on the same page about. And so the question of, is this change good for our society or is it not good for our society? We don't necessarily agree. So it's always a controversial, debatable thing, this change that's always happening. And some changes matter more than others. We didn't really shift the way that we did things just because we got our textbooks electronically, for instance, or that we can read books on our ebook reader or on our phones versus having to go to the bookstore or the library. Those are significant, but it's not as important as the fact that we can stream our music and our videos and our movies. That has changed a whole lot more, right? So it's the same kind of technology, books versus TV and movies, and we have these streaming and electronic ways, but some changes are going to be more impactful or more important than others. So it's always happening, sometimes intentional, sometimes not so much. It's almost always controversial, and some changes are going to happen differently than others. There's a video that I like to show in my on my face-to-face classes. It's a pretty short video talking about the importance of power, and I'll make sure I link it. It's probably going to pop up at the top, and I'll try to remember to put the description in the bottom too. But we've talked about, or we will talk about, that power is the ability to exercise your will over others. We get that from Max Weber. Power is just the ability to exercise your will over others. It's the ability to make people do what you want them to do. And there's a number of ways that power will manifest itself. Again, this video talks about some of those ways, either through social norms. We've talked already in this class about the generalized other, either through physical force or violence. I'm sure you have a sense of that. The state or the government or laws tell you what you can do or what you can't do. So there's some power in the law in being able to tell you what you're able to do. You understand already that there's some wealth. We just talked about the power elite. People with a certain amount of wealth or access to resources can usually have power over others or power in sort of defining what their life is going to be like. Sometimes it can be an idea, again, values or thoughts about things like liberty, or social justice or justice for all or equality. Those are just ideas, but they certainly impact sort of how we expect people to be. And it has some power to sort of impact somebody's life. Again, like power to make you do a certain thing. But one of those things that's talked about in this video, and this is where we're going with this chapter when we talk, just coming away from talking about groups and organizations, for instance, is that one of the sources of power are numbers, the power of the people. The people have the ability to make social change happen. That is a tremendous amount of power when you talk about how numbers of people operating together can make things change. So we care about society and society sustaining itself. And there's always a question of how do we maintain social order? How do we maintain a society that stays the way that it's supposed to stay and people do what it is that they're supposed to do? How do we maintain that kind of social order for the sake of the stability of society? Um, and then sort of manage the fact that things are going to change all the time. That's always a question. Are we growing and doing what we should be doing so that we can get better? Or are the changes that we're going to having the potential to destabilize our society? And so again, this winds up being at the end of the semester where they become your marching orders to go do great things. But it's also very important when we talk about groups and organizations and even the role of deviance to say, how do we understand the ways that people come together and how they act together? Because they have the power to make things happen. They have the power to change the world. So there's two very significant distinctions that I want to be able to give you before I end this video. One of them is this idea of collective behavior. Collective behavior is any non-institutionalized activity in which everyday people voluntarily engage. And when I say it's non-institutionalized, it means it's not related to the family, it's not related to the government, it's not related to education. There are no outside rules or expectations of the patterns of behavior. It's non-institutionalized. It's not already governed by something. It's just group behavior that is not mandated or regulated by anything else. It's just numbers, groups, collections of people who decided to do something that they wanted to do. And when you have collective behavior, you can either be talking about a mass or you can be talking about a public. A mass, M-A-S-S, is a relatively large group of people with a common interest, but they don't have to be in close proximity. So think about people who play the same game or who have the same interest in games or fans of the same team. You can be a Chicago Bears fan and you could literally live anywhere in the world. So you don't have to have close proximity, but your fandom of the Chicago Bears, for instance, make you a mass. When I talk about the masses, I'm talking about people who share interest, who don't necessarily have to be in close proximity. A public, on the other hand, is an unorganized, relatively diffuse group of people who share ideas. In this case, we're not talking about having an interest in a particular thing. It's just that in this case, you have similar ideas. So think about being generally liberal or generally conservative. You have similar political ideas, even if you're not a member of the Democratic Party or a Republican Party. You don't have to be a member of the same group, but you generally share ideas. So when you say, I would like to know what the public thinks, you're wondering, what do people who generally believe this thing or that thing, I want to know what they think about an issue. You're talking about people and their general similarity in ideas. And again, they don't have to be members, official members in a roster, membership roster, list, whatever. They don't have to be parts of a particular political party. They are aligned because they share ideas. So those words that you hear in everyday conversation, especially on the news and research and stuff like that, when I'm talking about the masses or when I'm talking about the public, I'm talking about large groups of people who either share a common interest or share common ideas, and they never even have to come into close proximity of others. And then the reason I'm pointing this out is because the behavior that they do, the behavior that they do as a member of a mass or a member of a public, is very critical when we think about social change, because those kinds of power, there's a lot of power in the collective behavior of people doing something that they want to have done. And when we think about social change, the power of the people is always important. So we will continue on to talk about some of those very particular types of collective behavior and a lot more stuff going on in chapter 21.